And what we're going to do is advance forward the next item in the program, which is a conversation about how Georgian democracy and development is perceived in the United States and the West. And for that, I'm going to be joined on stage here with Damon Wilson from the Atlantic Council, who has been deeply involved with Georgia for many, many years, and also David Kramer from Florida International University, and formerly of Freedom House and a colleague of mine at the McCain Institute. And so we'll get this conversation started. Let me pass out the microphones. Thank you. And what I would like to start our conversation with is a question kind of picking up some of the themes from President Margvelashvili. A lot has been done, and a lot hasn't been done. Let's start internally in the state of Georgian democracy. Where do you see it on a trajectory, and what has been a success, what has been a failing, what needs to happen next? And David, let me start with you, and then Damon, if you would address that from your perspective too.
Let me start by. Is this working? There we are. Let me start by offering something that I've done in many places, and that is to start from a point of humility. I think particularly for Americans these days, we should start from a point of humility given what I would consider some real turmoil back at home. The worst polarization that I've seen in my lifetime, questions about the commander-in-chief, a Congress that thinks the word compromise is a swear word. So let's acknowledge that up front. We're up here, the three of us, as longtime supporters and friends of Georgia, but we're not here to lecture or scold, because more than ever, I would say we're not in a position to do so, if we ever were. That said, I've been struck since last year's parliamentary elections that Georgian dream seems focused on consolidation of power for the sake of consolidating power without a real vision on what to do with that power. And it seems hell-bent on making sure that the opposition, which had been in power, does not return to power. And so I think we're in a bit of an unfortunate cycle where neither side is looking out for the greater interests of the country, but they're too busy going to battle with each other.
But as you said, this is kind of politics, right?
It's absolutely politics, but let me add one more point. This country can't afford to screw up. It can't afford to screw up right now because our country is screwed up and Europe is screwed up. And if you screw up, then no one's going to pay attention to you. It's as simple as that. You have to succeed. You have to make it difficult for us in the West to say we have to pay attention. And we have to respond to your aspirations to join your Atlantic institutions. If you screw up, if you become so focused on internal battles, it is very easy for us to just throw up our hands and say, there they go again. There are leaders in the West who are looking for excuses not to pay attention to this country. Don't give them those pretexts. Make it impossible for us to ignore you by being such a shining city on the hill, as Ronald Reagan said about the United States. And you have plenty of hills here, so it shouldn't be that difficult.
And Damon and I both worked on NATO issues in the late 90s and early 2000s, and we have the Estonian president coming later today. That was kind of the lesson from the Baltic states, and especially Estonia, but also Lithuania and Latvia, that there were, at that time, lots of European countries and the United States and members of the Senate who didn't want to have to deal with the Baltic states, thought that they were impossible to defend, thought that they were too close to Russia, thought that we shouldn't be expanding NATO at all. And what happened is that they provided such a good example of vibrant democracy, of cleaning up the economy, of standing for values that represented our values, that it was impossible to consider expanding NATO without including the Baltic states. So it went from being an impossibility to being an inevitability because there was no way that this was going to happen without them. And I think that is a great lesson for Georgia, as you point out. You got to, Condi Rice wrote in her book, twice as good. You got to be twice as good, but then you make it as well too. Damon, what are your thoughts?
Well, Kurt, I think your point's the way I want to come at this, because look, we're foreign policy folks. We're not political folks. We're poor substitutes for the presidential candidates today, but we're actually poor substitutes for being in the mind of the political game. We're in that field, but we come to from a foreign policy set of expertise. So I think it's pretty easy to sometimes be naive about the reality of politics and how much of political fight we see in healthy democracies on big issues every day. But I think the reason why the connection for us as people that are so committed to Georgia's place in the world is because it is the fundamental connection. It is precisely because of the viability of Georgia's democracy, which frankly makes it an outlier in this region, that it means that our country, the United States, and our alliance is going to take the interests in helping this experiment here. So I don't want to be naive about the type of battles that are going to unfold on particular issues in campaigns here, but I do worry that there's a chance that we can lose sight of the historic struggle in which this struggle takes place. And we're moving into a historic struggle right now between the free world and authoritarian kleptocracies. And we don't fully appreciate that. In fact, we're in the midst of transatlantic divisions, uncertainty on our own models, lack of confidence in our own democracies, institutions as the best way of life. When our adversaries are pretty clear, there's a great historic struggle between state capitalism, authoritarian kleptocracy, and the free world. And so the issue for Georgia is how to embed itself in the free world, in our world. And therefore, the issue of Georgian democracy isn't about ideals and niceties. It's an existential issue for where this country finds its place in the world and its ability to survive in a rough neighborhood. And the reason why it makes it worth capitals in Berlin, Brussels, Washington, Paris, elsewhere, to be shaped and tempted to intertwine our destinies together, because you're going to exceed those expectations in many respects. Like the Baltic states, NATO enlargement was always not driven out of Washington. It was driven by demand and progress in key capitals, whether it started in Budapest and Warsaw against a reluctant West, or in the Baltic states exceeding sort of expectations. It's why the way campaigns unfold here, the evolution of the democracy here, I think is an existential issue of where Georgia's going to find its place in the world and why we're invested in your democracy.
One of the things I'm really struck in what both of you said is that we're in the same contest. In our own societies, we are facing problems of democracy and values, fighting off internal challenges as much as external challenges. So Georgia is as much a part of that same struggle that we're going through in the United States, in Western Europe, between far-right movements, nationalist movements, populist movements, and so forth. Georgia's facing the same values challenges and fighting for the same things that a lot of us, I think, are fighting for. That kind of brings us into a topic I wanted to ask about. We're going to have a whole session this afternoon on foreign policy during the Trump administration. I think the title we chose for this is It Better Than It Seems? But what I would really love to hear you guys talk about, for an international and a Georgian audience, how do you understand the difference between domestic political fighting in the United States, particularly over Russia, and foreign policy, toward Russia and U.S. attitudes on dealing with these international challenges. How do you understand this, and where's the dividing line, and how do you explain it? Damon, you first.
So I think in many respects, we are in a sort of a low point on the tenor and nature of our domestic political debate. On a foreign policy side, we're actually at a high point in terms of a bipartisan consensus on standing by our allies and standing up for our friends and standing up to authoritarians. It's pretty remarkable right now when you're walking the halls of Capitol Hill that on any issue that is really standing up to Putin's imperialism, thuggishness, or standing by an ally, a country like Georgia, we've got 98 votes in the U.S. Senate. It's pretty hard to recall when there's been that type of depth of consensus across the political spectrum. Right after Helsinki, I was up testifying before the Helsinki Commission, which brings the Senate and the House together, and to listen to the House members from the Congressional Black Caucus with two conservative Southern Republican senators talking about Russia in exactly the same way, it was really compelling to me. And so there's a lot of noise. It's messy. It's really unpleasant on the political front in the United States. And it's going to get messier, and it's going to get more unpleasant, and it's going to dominate headlines domestically and internationally. But if you're a Georgian thinking about your national interests, this is a good golden moment for your interests, because there's been a creeping realization across the United States. We don't have to go back to the basics of making the case we were a few years ago of, wait, recognize the challenge we face from the Kremlin today. We got it. Our political class gets that, our Congress gets that. And despite sometimes mixed rhetorical messages coming from perhaps the president sometimes, we've got a pretty good run on policy issues. And so I see this as an important opportunity to consolidate some of the gains in advancing what we're doing bilaterally with U.S. Georgia in support of all of our allies and partners, particularly in Europe's East. I see this as an opportunity for us to help eliminate this concept of a status quo setting in place, locking in a permanent gray zone in which you're trapped. This is our time to chip away at that, even as we've got messy politics, messy transatlantic relations. I still see a savvy opportunity to advance some of the policy goals that I think we share with this audience.
You know, you said about a fight back in the U.S. about policy. It's a bizarre fight. It's everyone else against Donald Trump, including people in his own administration. The actions, the policies of the administration are pretty damn good. Beefing up of sanctions, beefing up of U.S. military presence, LNG exports to the region, Vice President Pence's visit here a year ago, the fact that we have Andrea Thompson here for this conference, Wes Mitchell here for this conference, that's terrific. It's a real demonstration of administration support for Georgia, for a tough pushback policy against the Putin regime. And then you have the president. I can't figure it out. It's a total disconnect. And I know there are those who say focus on the actions, not on the rhetoric. I can do that up to a point, but you can't dismiss the words of the President of the United States. He is the most powerful individual in the world. And so it is baffling to me that we have this problem. But that said, in the Congress, there is, not unanimous, but close to it, support for this country. And support for a tough hardline policy in dealing with the Putin regime. And I think Georgia can capitalize on that. But again, Georgia can't afford to slip back. It has to stay on a forward track. There is no linear path to democracy. We're seeing a number of examples around the world and on this continent of backsliding when it comes to democracy. This country is one that arguably can least afford it. So the key is to stay on the right democratic path. And I think you will be reciprocated with strong support in Washington.
And I'd like to add a couple of points to this topic as well. One of them is we have a stronger consensus. You both said this. We have a stronger consensus on national security policy in the United States today than we've had for 25 years. So we are at a high point, I believe, in seeing a strong national security policy. Why is that? Essentially, you had, until recently, a Democratic Party that was accommodationist, I would argue, toward Russia, reset policy toward Russia, pulling missile defense out of the Czech Republic and Poland and all that. And a Republican national security policy was very traditional, of a hard line towards Russia and pro-freedom, pro-democracy, pro-NATO enlargement, things like that. So there was a big debate. And remember the 2012 presidential campaign, in a debate about foreign policy, Mitt Romney said Russia's the main strategic challenge facing the United States, and Barack Obama, the president, ridiculed that and said he's coming out of the 1980s. Democrat foreign policy has changed, and partly driven by this hatred of Donald Trump, has changed to be as strong on national security as the Republican national security policy has always been. And that has produced these 98 votes in the Senate, that now everybody is on the same page. That's quite remarkable. So that is a very good situation. The other point I wanted to throw at this is that, like Georgia, like Ukraine, like France, like Germany, the United States has been the target of Russian interference in electoral campaigns with a view towards favoring particular candidates or parties in the elections. This in the United States has the particular result of the Democrats asserting under their breath or through the media that somehow Donald Trump is not right. You know, he shouldn't be here. And Donald Trump reacting to that by saying, never, 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 no collusion, nothing, never give an inch. And that is the source of the massive, divisive, polarized political debate that we have in the country right now. It is not actually about Russia. It's not actually about foreign policy. It's about legitimacy of the president versus the legitimacy of, or the lack of legitimacy of the election, and a different result that could have taken place for the Democrats. That political argument hasn't stopped. It's not going to stop. It's going to go right through the next, midterms and right through the next presidential election campaign as well. But don't confuse that with where the country has gotten to on foreign and national security policy in defense of our values. So that.
I mean, I'd say less from a political prism, but where the country is landing, our country in its political debate since 9/11 was really dominated by how to deal with the challenge of terrorism, Islamic terrorism, and that drove so much in terms of the imagination of our public and the national security apparatus. And you've seen an incredibly rapid shift to really an understanding that the world is different, shaped by the return of great power, politics, and competition, where the looming force and presence of China over the next 100 years is a really dominant factor now in U.S. national security thinking, and that Russia is a component of that because it's a declining power that can actually wreak some havoc. And this is where it's hard for us to keep sight on the fact that our politics are going to remain heated. Politics in Europe, we're democracies, your politics are going to remain heated. It's difficult to remain focused on the fact that the big competition is actually between what unites us across those partisan divides, a free people, and those that are not free. And everything we're worried about, whether it's the future of artificial intelligence or global commodity supplies, is going to be affected of whether free people are helping to set the terms on those big issues that affect the future of the world, or whether authoritarian regimes are. And it's hard for us to stay sighted on that because of our own polarization in politics. But that's why for Georgians, as much as it matters that we're selling javelins to Georgia today, which is a great development, part of Georgia's defense in a very uncertain world is the credibility and integrity of its democracy. That becomes part of Georgia's defense through a time of uncertainty. And I think that's why there's such a strong connection between what happens internally and the foreign policy objectives here, and how to navigate that in what's going to be a very tumultuous time in the transatlantic relationship, both in European politics and the U.S.
And maybe if I can come back to the point of humility that I started with, and that is to learn maybe from some of the problems we're going through and don't repeat our mistakes. For example, don't call for law enforcement agencies to go after your enemies unless they've committed a crime. Maintain the integrity of rule of law. When you start vitiating rule of law, then society itself starts to fall apart, and your enemies then really take advantage. Avoid chants of lock her up or lock him up, whoever the pronoun is, and make sure that opposition has room to voice its views and participate in the political process. Second, the media is not the enemy of the people. Avoid terms like fake news, unless it's disinformation coming from hostile sources. You need to have a diversity of views. Ideally, you should have objective journalism and reporting facts and information, but don't demonize the media, because the media acts as a critical crutch in the development of a democratic society, as an additional check and balance that has played a vital role in our country's development for 270 some odd years. And try, to the extent possible, third and last, to avoid such polarization that you get nothing done. Demonstrate that democratic institutions can actually function and work and can produce results. It is a messy process. It's designed to be a messy process so that one party and one force cannot exert itself onto the other. But don't reach such a point in politics where nothing gets done and the average citizen becomes disillusioned and disgruntled and might, in fact, become prone to listen to hostile outside forces as they try to exploit disunity in your own country.
There's one more topic I wanted to come to before we go to the coffee break. And this would be, okay, Georgia's messy, we're messy. What is your advice? Yeah, what is your advice to Western leaders? I'm thinking Germany, France, US, UK. What is your advice to Western leaders about how they should be thinking about and dealing with Georgia?
So let me say one thing domestically and then connect it to that point. Look, times are uncertain. The support from the West is ambiguous. You're in a dangerous neighborhood. And so I do see the instinct here of how do you maintain stability in Georgia? Fundamentally, how do you maintain stability? And I think that leads to the temptation of how do you control things so that this is a stable environment? And I think what David's talking to is you create stability in this risky neighborhood either by having control, in which that stability can be ephemeral, or creating a system in which people are protected because of the rule of law, because of the transparency, because foreign investors know their investors are going to be protected just as much as individual citizens aren't afraid of arbitrary detention or arrest, and there's transparency because the media operates. So there's this real tension between the ephemeral stability that comes from control and the enduring stability that comes from a system that helps provide that sense of confidence. And I think that's kind of playing out behind the scenes in this campaign and this evolution right now about how to maintain stability in a really turbulent time internationally when Western support is ambiguous and your adversaries are not ambiguous. And therefore, that comes to my point about Berlin, Washington, Paris. I don't think we should be ambiguous. I think that the more we're able to say, we got your back, we're with you, the more I think the right decisions will unfold inside this country to actually give up some control domestically, build the institutional basis for that security and stability, because we've made it clear that as this evolves, you're part of our family, and we're not going to hedge that we see a pathway about how you're going to be part of the West, part of our institutions, how we're going to bolster our bilateral relationship, but also what that means for NATO and the EU, and to be explicit about where we want to go, to give Georgians the confidence to actually give up a little bit of the control internally, to begin strengthening actually the structure of rule of law, the democratic institutions that will provide, I think, what is real stability over time.
That's a brilliant point. Thanks. David, did you want to comment? Or?
One additional point I would say is transparency and accountability are critical to development of a democratic society, which means the people who are elected or are nominated for various positions should be the ones with the ultimate authority and responsibility and then be held accountable. It's not healthy, as Giga was saying yesterday, or normal for somebody behind the scenes to be pulling the strings without full accountability and transparency. You have to be careful about the role of money. We have to be careful of this in our society. Senator McCain was one of the leading proponents of campaign finance reform, and it got turned down and rejected by the Supreme Court. Money, wherever the source, domestically or from outside forces, can have a terribly corrupting influence on a country's development. And so it's very important, I think, to demand transparency and accountability from your officials. When it comes to the West, the day that countries don't want to join organizations that we are members of, the United States is not a member of the European Union, but we have valued the European Union over the decades. We are a member of NATO. The day that Georgia or Ukraine or any other country in the Balkans doesn't want to join our organizations, that's the day we have to question the future of those organizations. But when a Georgia aspires to join, and in fact essentially meets the criteria, particularly in the case of NATO, where it's been such an enormous contributor to NATO operations in various places around the world, we have to respond to that. Otherwise, we ourselves are undermining those very institutions. And so as long as countries are knocking at the door, we have a responsibility to at least answer and see who's at the door and see if we want to let them in. Make sure they meet the criteria and standards, but then make sure that we widen the scope of institutions that have been critical and in fact indispensable to ensuring peace on this continent for the past 7 decades.
Yeah. I saw a hand in the audience, and I want to give the audience members an opportunity to comment as well. Michał Baranowski from Poland, right here in the second row.
Thank you very much, Kurt. First of all, it's wonderful to be with you all here in TBDC, and sorry for being 1 day late, but wonderful to see you and everyone here. My question is related to what you asked about U.S. foreign policy. And, you know, Damon mentioned on one hand Javelin, but on the other hand that the real strength and importance of Georgia's success lies in its democracy and strength of its democracy. So my question is about how do you judge U.S. foreign policy's performance when it comes, this administration, when it comes to support for democracy and Democrats? Because on one hand you have javelins, but then what about what's going on internally? And do we really, because I think at times I see that the administration is seeing this as a dilemma. You either have a strong security policy and cooperation, or you are working, or you actually are supporting Democrats and democracy. So let's take the example of Georgia. What do you think, and what do you think U.S. administration should be doing about democracy? Thanks.
Damon, why don't you take that?
So I'm a strong proponent of the fact that there isn't a dilemma built into security and our values here. I think they're fundamentally linked, which is why I tried to make the core argument that part of Georgia's defense strategy is the integrity of its democracy. What that means for U.S. foreign policy is that I think that a sustainable American policy is one that's been articulated consistently by Senator John McCain over time, that our values, our interests are advanced by the spread of by the resonance of our values. And that's a fundamental part of effectiveness of how we actually shape America's role in the world. In my view, that means I would prefer to see clearer, I think words do matter. I think the way we speak about the role that individual liberties, democracy, all of these values play in our foreign policy. Talk to Vladimir Karamurza, to be specific as in American foreign policy, whether it's for activists or principles, I think is something that is core to being able to advance our interests here. I think it makes the fact of us selling javelins to Georgia more effective when it's explicitly linked to that. And I think we've got some scope for stepping up on that front.
I'm going to add a point to Damon's answer, which is I think, of course, we must stand for freedom, democracy, values, etc. We face greater security and existential challenges to countries today than we faced 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago. And so we need to keep pushing on the democracy and the values front, not walk away from that. But we also need to make sure that we are actually working with our allies, even with their failings, and making sure that those countries that are fundamentally with us are indeed with us, and we are working together, not driving them away. So there's a balance to strike here, and sometimes I think we can finger wag at certain countries, maybe certain countries near here, and lose the strategic picture. And we can't lose the strategic picture. We got to actually pull our side together, given some of the existential threats we face from outside, while still pursuing a democracy and values agenda. In third row here.
Thank you very much. I suppose I'm the fourth, but if you would excuse me.
Fourth row.
All right. Turkish Ambassador Fatma Ceren Yazgan in Tbilisi. My question is about actually something about very specific in US. So I don't know where best to raise this question in such a Republican audience. Now, President talked about just 30 minutes ago about strong leaders or weak politicians. And in Europe, there's a problem with that. In all the regions, there's a problem with that, and actually, hence populism. Now, we know about the meddling and foreign intervention to elections, and that has been going on since the Cold War, actually during the Cold War and after the Cold War. And it happened in a place where we thought it would never have. But that happened after certain party political primaries, as you call them. So how did your president came out from very strong party political systems in your system? How did he came out among those candidates? Why was he able to come that far in your political party? So that's my question. Thank you.
I think that's a great question. I'd love to address that, but you should as well. But in my view, this is, you hit it on the head. This is a phenomenon that we've seen in our country and in many other countries in Europe. The established political class, establishment politicians and leaders have failed to address issues that are of major importance to the population in ways that the population finds credible. And as a result, they are looking for alternatives to that establishment. And Donald Trump was extraordinarily effective at understanding that, identifying it, and speaking to it. And he just cut down every single other Republican candidate that were there. I think there were 17 of them. Just cut down every single one of them because he was tapping into that sense of frustration. And we've seen this with the AfD in Germany, with Sweden Democrats over the weekend, and so forth. I think the answer to that is our political leaders, our business leaders, our society leaders need to do a far better job of understanding what our populations are concerned about, finding ways to address those concerns in real time, credibly, and being able to talk about it in ways that the population understands. And I don't see a country in our community yet that has figured out how to do that, but that's the challenge, and I think where we need to go. And
Can I just add quickly? I think he was also helped by the fact that the 16 other Republican candidates formed a virtual circular firing squad and took each other out and didn't take him seriously. He was standing outside of that. He was also helped after he got the nomination by the fact that the Democrats put up a horrible candidate who ran a horrible campaign. People didn't want another Clinton in many respects. A lot of Republicans didn't want another Bush. We're a country of 330 million people. You'd think we could find somebody with a last name that wasn't Bush or Clinton to run for president. And so he took advantage of this.
I could go with another
move.
Wilson, though. I could go.
A Wilson, if nominated.
As the nonpartisan actor up on this stage, I'm going to leave the political questions to my colleagues. So I'm a radical nonpartisan centrist here.
Okay. There are a couple more hands in the audience, but I want to keep the program moving. We have a lot of other things coming up today. Thank you for bearing with this vanity project of us talking about our views. And please take a break for coffee. We'll resume at 11:15. Thank you.